Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Welcome to Cineversary, a podcast that celebrates a milestone anniversary of a masterful work of cinema. Each month we send happy birthday wishes to a different film currently observing a joyous jubilee, everything from a 20th to a 100th anniversary. I'm your host, Eric Martin, creator and moderator of the Cineverse Film Discussion Group that meets weekly in the Chicagoland area. They say in space, no one can hear you scream. At least that's the tagline to the poster of the film we'll be covering this month. None other than Alien from 1979, directed by Ridley Scott. A fitting fright flick for October, which celebrates a 40th birthday this year. And like any good birthday party, Cineversary invites special guests to partake in the celebration. So in this installment, I'm actually joined by two guests. Mike Muncer, the UK-based film journalist, producer, and host of the Evolution of Horror podcast, as well as Andrea Subissati, the Toronto-based executive editor of Rue Morgue magazine and co-host of the long-running Faculty of Horror podcast. Together, we'll examine why Alien is worth celebrating all these years later, its cultural impact and legacy, what we can learn from the picture today, how it has stood the test of time, and more. Before I welcome my guests, however, let's get some historical context on this month's movie, courtesy of Wikipedia. Alien is a 1979 science fiction horror film directed by Ridley Scott and written by Dan O'Bannon. Based on a story by O'Bannon and Ronald Shusett, it follows the crew of the commercial space tug Nostromo, who encounter the eponymous alien, a deadly and aggressive extraterrestrial set loose on the ship. The film stars Tom Skerritt, Sigourney Weaver, Veronica Cartwright, Harry Dean Stanton, John Hurt, Ian Holm, and Yaphet Kotto. It was distributed by 20th Century Fox. The alien and its accompanying artifacts were designed by the Swiss artist H.R. Geiger. Alien premiered on May 25, 1979 in the United States, before receiving a wide release on June 22nd, and was also released September 6th in the United Kingdom. It was met with critical acclaim and box office success, winning the Academy Award for Best Visual Effects, along with numerous other nominations. It has been consistently praised in the years since its release, and is considered one of the greatest films of all time. In 2002, Alien was deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant by the Library of Congress and was selected for preservation in the U.S. National Film Registry. In 2008, it was ranked by the American Film Institute as the 7th best film in the science fiction genre and as the 33rd greatest film of all time by Empire magazine. Alien is estimated to have grossed more than $200 million on an original budget of about $11 million. It currently holds a 97% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes, where its average critical score is an impressive 9.07 out of 10. Ready for some goosebumps? All right, let's have a listen to Alien's original trailer. Prior to introducing Andrea and Mike, be aware that there are plenty of spoilers ahead. So if you've not already viewed Alien, all 2 or 3 of you, put down this podcast, give the movie a watch first, and come back. Y'all back? Great. I'm now proud to introduce my esteemed guests. Welcome, Mike and Andrea. Thank you so much for agreeing to be guests on Cineversary.
Thank you so much for having me, Eric.
Thanks for having me.
When and where did you see this film initially, and why is this movie important to you in any way? Mike, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Andrea.
Oh, it's tricky. I've had to think about that because in some ways it feels like this film has always been with me. And I was trying to think back to the first time I watched it, and I think I was very young actually, as with so many horror films. I'm sure lots of people have had this experience. They sort of come to it way younger than they should be. And I grew up with older siblings who both watched a lot of horror films. So I think I was introduced to a lot of these types of movies quite young. And I remember Alien, my dad had the VHS, the videotape of Alien, and I just remember being so intrigued and captivated even by the box, even by that famous poster. The front cover of the video had the sort of egg, the glowing green egg with the crack in it, and that was all you could see. And I was so intrigued as to what this movie was, and I remember for a while my parents wouldn't let me watch it. They said it's going to be too scary for you. So there was that sort of build up. And I think the first time I watched it, I was probably about 12 or 13.
Okay.
And so I was young. But actually, funnily enough, in the first sort of 30 minutes maybe of the movie, it's actually quite a slow-going movie. And I remember at the time, being a kind of young horror hound that I was actually a little bit disappointed initially. I thought, oh, this is quite slow-going. And then, of course, I was absolutely knocked out and bowled over at that scene, at the chestburster scene, and from then on it absolutely had me in the palm of its hand. I was terrified. So it kind of really took me by surprise, and I was really glad actually that I saw it before I'd heard or read too much about it, so I really didn't know what was coming. Right. And I think it's a movie actually that I've appreciated more and more and more upon rewatches. Like I said, when you're young, I think there are certain elements of this movie that may go over your head and that I found quite slow. Other than those sort of bursts of horror, there's a lot of talking, but I watched it repeatedly as I got older, and I've just grown to love it more and more. And it is a film that's hugely important to me now because, it's one of those movies that just completely holds up. And you see, especially now that I very much look in my podcast and in my own sort of spare time at the history of the horror genre and those movies that are so important to the evolution of the genre, and Alien it's such an important movie, and it's still absolutely terrifying.
Andrea, how about you?
Well, I wish I could tell you exactly when and where I first saw this film. The Faculty of Horror did a 2-part episode on the Alien franchise. We kind of broke up
I remember
the
that
entire franchise into a couple of pieces, and Alien was in my mind, it was in my memory, it was kind of an unformed memory. What I remembered was Aliens was the sequel that came out. That was what really stuck in my mind, and so I wasn't actually sure if I had seen Alien prior or if I saw Alien after the fact, and just the memories of the two kind of gelled together, because Alien is a lot more subtle film than Aliens.
Sure.
In many ways. It expands upon its themes, and it's just bigger and blastier and more bombastic, which is everything you want in a sequel. And I think Aliens is a really great example of a sequel done well. And while I don't think that Aliens overshadowed Alien in a way, I do think it's probably the Alien film that jumps to mind when people think about this story.
Yeah, I can echo a lot of those sentiments. Thanks for sharing those recollections. But yeah, I first saw Alien back on the VHS in 1986, I want to think. And I believe it was just prior to seeing the sequel, Aliens. I think I'd wanted to, catch up and find out, what was all the fuss about that I missed out on. I was a teenager as well. And I came late to the party, but it packed a wallop for me on first viewing and absolutely still holds up quite strongly. So I continue to revisit it every few years. I watched it again last night just for this podcast, and absolutely it continues to resonate so strongly.
Yeah, it's absolutely incredible. I had the privilege actually this year of seeing it restored on a big screen, and it's still sort of, I still break out in a slight cold sweat from it, and that's got to be something impressive.
That's the highest praise you can give to a horror movie, is not. So, All right, let's get into why this movie is worth celebrating all these years later. 40th anniversary of Alien. Why does it still matter, do you believe, and how has Alien stood the test of time? Andrea, why don't you go first?
I feel like Alien is just one of the greatest movies of all time, full stop. And it's a rare example of a horror sci-fi film to get such unanimous positive acclaim outside of the horror genre. You know, I'm a feminist film critic, I'm a horror nerd, I'm editor of this horror magazine, and I do this horror podcast. And I tend to spend a lot of time justifying my love of horror to the outside world. You know, people who would kind of throw a blanket over its quality and that it's just this and it's just that. But Alien, when Alien comes up, people shut up. People have respect for Alien. So for me, it's just kind of one of those touchstone films that comes up time and time again as an example of how beautiful and intelligent and gripping and smart and all the good things about horror films tend to come up in discussions about Alien. And also, you know, I'm often discussing feminism and horror films. I'm discussing final girls and stereotypical roles. And again, Alien comes up time and time again as an example of a movie that really got everything right. And it's just such a rare example of a film that I wouldn't change a thing. It's a perfect film in my view.
Mike, your thoughts?
Well, I think like some of the best horror movies, the best movies, I suppose, is that it's not really specific of a time or place. You know, it's set obviously in space, and there's something about it that you wouldn't really know that this was made in 1979 or 1999 or 1959 in some ways. I think the characters they're kind of universal archetypes in a way, and I think there's something that a lot of the sequels got wrong, particularly some of the recent ones like Prometheus. That what I love about Alien, the original, is that all of those characters, those people, they talk like normal people. They talk like human beings talk. There's nothing kind of grandiose about this spaceship and about these people on it. They're sort of your average blue-collar workers, and they have conversations about pay rises, and they argue over petty things, and there's sort of politics within them. And there's all of those kind of those kind of themes and those parts of the story that just do not age. So I think the setting and the characters are partly why this movie works so well. But then of course there's the horror, and I'm sure we'll get into this. But I think there's something about the alien, the design of the alien, and the way that the film is directed, that just taps into every single kind of human fear in some way. I think whatever you're afraid of, if you're afraid of the dark, this movie has it. If you're afraid of enclosed spaces, this movie has it. If you're afraid of wide open spaces, well, the movie's set in space. You know, if you're afraid of aliens or creature feature type monsters, of course this movie has it. But it also has kind of body horror. There's a lot of abject kind of gruiness. There's also a kind of dangerous artificial, there's a dangerous android on board. This movie has everything. There's something for everybody to be scared by or unnerved by in this, and yet it still feels beautifully simple. It still doesn't feel like it's throwing everything at you. So it's this beautiful marriage of being both incredibly simple but also just being packed with everything you would want in a classic movie.
Well said. Yeah, I can't improve upon that much. But my thoughts here are, I think the suspenseful pacing is superb in Alien. It forces us to get acquainted with the crew and with the ship for, as you said, the first 30 minutes, which in some people's opinions can be a bit slow. But to me, it's that slow burn that really sets the mood, and before any real action transpires. There isn't a lot of action in this movie, but there's just enough. And to me, the pacing is key. So, this is a slow burn compared to many contemporary action-infused horror and sci-fi pictures, and that's to the movie's credit, I believe. It still matters because the story unfolds slowly, with steadily rising intrigue and fear of the unknown that builds tension organically, without artificial sweeteners like an over-reliance on jump scares or gonzo creature effects. Now, there are some of those elements in here, but they don't overdo it, is what I'm getting at. And like Jaws and Halloween before it, it doesn't reveal what the monster looks like or feature it in its full form until we're like well past Act 1, even halfway through the movie. So collectively over the entire film, as I was watching it last night, I was trying to keep track, not literally with a stopwatch, but the xenomorph creature is probably shown less than 1 minute collectively. I mean, it's amazing. Yeah. So that's a testament to really good filmmaking, and the power of your imagination filling in what you cannot see. And if you overshow the monster here, I think it just defeats the purpose of the movie. So those are some strong elements and argument as to why this movie matters. And I have some other arguments here, but I'm saving them for some future questions. In what ways do you think Alien was influential on movies, cinema, or popular culture, or in any way set trends? Have you put your finger on this at all or identified anything? Well, let's go first with Mike, and then we'll follow up with Andrea's comments.
That's a really interesting one, because I wasn't around when this movie first came out, and for me it's so hard to imagine a world without this movie, and it's almost hard to know the extent of this movie's influence, because I'm sure it's so gigantic. I'm sure that 99% of genre movies and genre movie makers since have drawn in some way or another upon Alien, and it's not just sci-fi movies or alien movies. Now, of course, I'm sure this did spark a series of kind of, there are a lot of copycats. Even The Thing, John Carpenter's The Thing, a couple of years later, has similar kind of nasty, parasitic, body horror that comes from a sort of extraterrestrial being.
Oh, sure.
I think you can see its influence within the horror genre directly, and even the movies of directors like David Cronenberg. There's that element of body horror, which I think, even though Cronenberg had a couple of movies at this point, they were sort of fairly small and indie. And I think this brought the idea of body horror into the mainstream as well. So I think that's certainly something that it's influenced. But God, I can't even imagine actually, other types of movies it's influenced as well. I mean, there's the whole sci-fi element. There's this element of artificial intelligence and what it means to be human, and that's certainly something that Ridley Scott is fascinated by, because look at Blade Runner that came out a couple of years later,
right.
and it's something that he's still dealing with now in Prometheus and Alien Covenant. In fact, I think he's more interested by that element than he is the xenomorph. So yeah, I think there's a sci-fi element that has influenced movies. There's certainly a horror element that has influenced movies. And of course, let's also not forget Sigourney Weaver as this heroine, this, in effect, a kind of final girl, but this incredibly strong, independent female hero. And without her, we might not have had Sarah Connor and countless other sort of female action heroes that came after.
Andrea, what would you say here?
Well, I think once again, it's kind of it's on the darker side of Star Wars, right? Which was a huge deal. There was obviously interest in kind of taking cinema to the greater reaches of the galaxy and whatnot. And so here's this utter and total nightmare that manifests all the anxieties that we might have had undiscussed about space travel, about technological growth and movement. And again, I think as an early example of the final girl, the leading lady in horror sci-fi, I have it that Ripley wasn't initially written as a woman. And I think, even 40 years later, this is a discussion we're having where, women are written as women and heroes are written as heroes, and there isn't a lot of crossover in between. So insofar as I think this film is hugely influential, it did a lot of things right that we're still doing wrong.
Excellent points, and I'd just like to touch on some of those and add a few others here. In doing research on this, I mean, I do a film discussion group that meets weekly in the Chicagoland area, and we studied this movie more extensively last year, and I took some copious notes there, and I'm not a film scholar or historian or expert, but this was a completely new and unique kind of extraterrestrial creature. I mean, this xenomorph is one that stood out as like this biosexual monstrosity, this aberration of nature, thanks, of course, to its inspired design by H.R. Giger. Now, he was an artist known for his disturbing blend of the sexual and the mechanical. And to kind of riff on this point, I read Roger Ebert's extended review of this movie, and I want to quote him here. He says, "Alien uses a tricky device to keep the alien fresh throughout the movie. It evolves the nature and appearance of the creature, so we never know quite what it looks like or what it can do. The alien is capable of being just about any monster the story requires. Because it doesn't play by any rules of appearance or behavior, it becomes an amorphous menace, haunting the ship with the specter of shape-shifting evil. Ash, played by Ian Holm, the science officer, calls it a perfect organism. Its structural perfection is matched only by its hostility, and admits I admire its purity, its sense of survival, unclouded by conscience, remorse, or delusions of morality, unquote. I think this kind of alien stood in stark contrast to the benevolent aliens shown in Spielberg films like Close Encounters of the Third Kind and later E.T. So this was a kind of a throwback to like the 50s monster aliens who were out to destroy us, of course.
Yes.
But another way that Alien was innovative was, and I want to touch on what you brought up earlier, the crew. The crew here is quite different from other spaceship human crews depicted in other films. These guys and gals, they're not clean-cut, young, adventurous, or scientifically curious like perhaps in a movie like Forbidden Planet or something like that. Most are middle-aged, and they're blue-collar types concerned about getting paid and going through the routines of doing their jobs. I mean, they're sitting around smoking cigarettes constantly on this ship, and it just makes you think that it doesn't really matter that it's a sci-fi movie set in space. It could be set anywhere. Many aspects of the spacecraft deviated from the clean and antiseptic look of, let's say, Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, a movie that, of course, set the template for, high-quality science fiction films to follow. I want to read you another review here, excerpt. This is by Richard Scheib, who is a reviewer for Moria Reviews. He wrote, quote, "The pristine technologism that dominated interstellar interior decoration since 2001: A Space Odyssey gave way to a raw, grittier view, with the ship being designed as all dark corridors and exposed, dripping conduits. Ridley Scott loves this textural bombardment, and the ship's look is one of the most exciting works of junk fetishism to grace the postmodern science fiction movement. The look was influential. After Alien, the design schema of interstellar travel forever left behind the 2001 look of clean white antisepticism, where technology would triumph over humanity, and took place in a gritty, rundown world inhabited by working stiffs," unquote. I think Alien was also unique for its time in that it blended many different horror subgenres into one. They mix so many different subgenres in a creative way. So think about Alien, right? You've got science fiction horror, you've got body horror, the slasher movie, and you even have a touch of maybe the found footage subgenre when you consider when they first explore that planetoid and you see some of the video footage coming back on the monitor. Just smacked to me of, wow, this is a bit prescient of found footage, to me anyway. It combines elements of plausible realism. I mean, you consider the sequence featuring documentary-style live video footage, as we just talked about. And it also combines the classic slasher tropes in which the monster picks off the cast one by one with shocking kills, becoming the haunted house in space movie that Ridley Scott and company intended, right?
Yeah.
I think it also caught audiences off guard in that the handsome lead, played by, here it's Tom Skerritt, he isn't the final survivor. Instead, fittingly, it's a woman. And think about this, Andrea and Mike. You couldn't have avoided the strong marketing campaign behind this movie. The original trailer, the posters, the ads, and so forth. I mean, the marketing was groundbreaking and inspiring. I don't know if you ever saw the original trailer, but no trailer had really been done like that before. And the stark and ambiguous poster and ad campaign and the "no one in space can hear you scream" tagline, it really built up intrigue and anticipation for this movie. My last point is, you mentioned, okay, there has to be a lot of movies that were inspired or influenced by this. I just want to read you some of them that come to mind, right? Think about Species or Event Horizon, Mimic, The Relic, Deep Rising, Virus, Supernova, Pandorum, even Apollo 18. And there are many, many, many other examples. Aliens' influence is pervasive and far-reaching, and it was and is an important movie.
Yeah, agreed. Well, I think and that's the thing. I think it influenced so many horror movies, not just sci-fi ones, because I think, like you say, it crosses over into so many subgenres. It's almost hard to pin this movie down into a subgenre,
right?
Because, like you say, it could be a haunted house movie in space. It looks like a ghost story with those kind of visuals, those dark, shadowy corridors. It is, of course, it follows like you said, it follows a formula of a slasher with the body count and the final girl. Then, of course, there are elements of body horror, as we've discussed. So, yeah, it manages to kind of transcend categorization in some ways, even though it is so clearly a sci-fi horror. So, yeah, it's fascinating that way.
Andrea, did you have any thoughts to add here?
I think Ripley is quite singular in the pantheon of, I'm saying final girl, and I know there's going to be people listening to this who are like, no, she's not a final girl. She didn't drink, she didn't have sex. She doesn't really tick off all of the boxes of the final girl as per the original slasher trope. But, in my typology, in my personal typology, that just, posits her as a very competent and a resourceful heroine who she rises to the task. She was in a position of something leadership, and she pulls rank when she has to, but she's not listened to. She's underestimated, even though she leads with logic and then eventually by example. I think those are the traits of a final girl that she really personifies in a very, very meaningful way. She's not a reluctant hero. She's not afraid. However, like, it's something that that falls to her very naturally and very organically, which again is something believable, and it makes you believe her and in her.
Yes, what a fascinating character she is. But what's the moral to the story here, if we could kind of parse this through? What themes or messages are explored in Alien that are worthwhile talking about? Andrea, why don't you kick things off here?
Well, I mean, that is a big question. So Memory is Alien's original title as per Dan O'Bannon's early transcripts, but I haven't seen it yet, but it's a documentary that looks at some of the subliminal mythical origins of Alien, of like what goes into making the alien's shape, for example, some of the artwork, the awakening of the Furies, for example, Greek goddesses of revenge. Again, I haven't seen it. This is just, I obviously edited the article that went into Rue Morgue, but there's so much going on in this film. And for me personally, I think the reflection of the anxiety about technology, about space travel, about AI. I think Ash's whole storyline is just, can we trust something made by man? Because man can't be trusted, that's for damn sure. And just about not being ready for the bigger questions that technology has to ask. And that has been a theme prevalent in science fiction, horror movies, since the 50s. It's always been there. But again, Alien kind of takes it to a new level of authenticity and relatability. And then, of course, Ripley's display of feminine strength and resourcefulness as a hero is something that just really endears it in a lot of women's hearts, I think.
Good food for thought there, Andrea. Mike, what's your take on themes in Alien?
Well, I think it's probably the bleak notion that, we are not the top of the food chain like we think we are. I think there is an element to looking at us like little organisms in some ways. I think, when, look at this mix of characters we have here. We have these very flawed human beings on this ship who bicker and argue and they smoke and they all have their own characteristics, but they all have their own flaws in some ways. And then you've got Ash, this android, who is kind of, in some ways, he's free of all of the sort of flaws and pitfalls of humanity. And he, like you said earlier, he admires the makeup and the DNA and he admires the biology of the xenomorph, because the android and the xenomorph are these kind of pure, perfect organisms in some ways, which make them more dangerous.
You know who he reminds me of? That character reminds me so much. I don't remember the original character name, but if you recall the original The Thing from Another World from 1951, there's that great scientist character with the beard who kind of stands in stark contrast to all the other team members and team players on that crew, and it seems like he's in the corner with the monster, trying to defend it, trying to keep it alive, and so forth. And I think that might have been a great influence, perhaps, on this character.
Yeah, no, I agree. And actually, there's even touches of, even though it are visually completely different, but there's touches of Hal, even 2001's Hal, I think, in Ash. This artificial thing, sure. The voice, the kind of, it's quite emotionless, just very logical, very cold, one agenda, And I think it's just that bleak notion that, like we said, we think we can conquer everything, but we're such a small speck in the universe. There's so much out there that could be bigger and badder than us, And this movie, I think, really taps into that feeling of this tiny, tiny little spaceship in the middle of this vast cosmos, and these people that are completely screwed really in the situation they're in, without the safety of society or their home planet or all of the things they're used to. So I think that's definitely one, and I think there's a lot of very interesting Freudian stuff going on under the surface of this movie in terms of how scared we all are of sex, of genitalia, of our own body, of bodily functions. I mean, I'm sure it's no coincidence, as I'm sure many critics and academics have discussed, that the xenomorph does look like a penis at times. Other times it looks like a vagina. There's lots of moist, wet fluids. And all of this stuff is creepy. It is scary. It puts me on edge. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that I think I learn about myself watching this, because I'm thinking, why am I so put off and scared by this creature design? But there's something about the way this thing is designed that is just so inherently terrifying,
Right.
So I think there's big existential themes about our place in the universe, but there's also these very micro themes about the human body and our own insecurities and our own fears of ourselves as well.
Yeah, just to kind of continue that thought, absolutely, biological and sexual fears stand as a strong theme here. So, as you mentioned, the film is replete with symbols and acts and suggestions of genitalia and things like that. But consider how terrifying male and female reproductive organs are as depicted in this movie, at least in the creature design. Consider how, like, the alien's head and inner jaws, as well as the newborn chestburster, they all serve as, like, threatening phallic symbols, right? And the strange ship the crew explores, when they go inside, it looks like, first off, from the outside, it looks like two open legs or something. And its interiors resemble a body cavity or maybe even a uterus or something like that. So, and there's many creatures and characters who seem to be committing substitute forms of rape or biological violation. You think about the facehugger alien that forces entry inside the mouth.
Oh, God,
You recall the chest burster that emerges from the torso. You've got that fully formed alien that kills Veronica Cartwright's character. We see the tail pointed between her legs, insinuating like a rape of sorts.
Yeah.
And even just a strange scene where you have Ash the android attacking Ripley in a rape-like action wherein what does he use to try to kill her? A porno magazine.
Yeah,
which is just bizarre.
Tries to shove a porno magazine down her throat, doesn't he? Which is just,
Right. It's like, so that couldn't have been happen chance. That must have been an intentional kind of thing from the filmmakers.
Yeah.
Continuing this theme, if you will. And then there's the last scene where the alien attacks Ripley after she strips off almost all of her clothes. So insinuations of rape or fear of rape or penetration, and that continues throughout the movie. Some other themes that come to the surface here, for me anyway: dehumanization. So consider how the Weyland-Yutani Corporation, what does it value? It values alien life forms over its own human crew.
Yeah.
And we see how humans are used as reproductive fodder for the aliens.
Yeah.
Primal fears, you touched on this, of things like insects, body horror, claustrophobia, rape, being trapped. These are all things that are universal and everyone can relate to some extent, right? And then a few other things to think about. Birth. There are several symbolic depictions of birth or even conception in the picture.
Yeah.
So when the movie starts, you've got the crew rising from hypersleep. That's a birth of a sort. When the ship untethers from its umbilicus, if you recall that earlier scene, it's a bit of a birth, right? And when the crew, of course, explores the alien ship, entering through those tunnels seemingly designed to resemble the female reproductive system, whether it's Geiger or Scott or Dan O'Bannon or a collective of all these different talents, they're going for something primal here, and I think it really works very effectively.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Now, this is a curious one, especially, again, we're not film historians, right? But I have to use our imaginations a little bit here. But who do you think this film appealed to initially when it was released in 1979? And who do you think it appeals to today? And if that appeal has changed, what does that say about Aliens' impact, influence, and legacy?
Yeah, I can't help but think that, this coming 2 years after Star Wars, it obviously tonally couldn't be more different, but I'm sure in some ways this was maybe tapping into a sci-fi trend that was happening. Obviously, we were about 10 years after 2001. We're a couple of years after Star Wars. There have been some other big hitter space movies in the 70s, like Silent Running, etc. So I think, I wouldn't be surprised if there were a lot of sci-fi fans and space movie fans that were going into this. But of course, tonally it couldn't be more different, and it was very much marketed like a horror movie. So I'm sure that horror fans went along to this as well. But I imagine there was that sci-fi pull that must have really helped with what was popular in the box office. Close Encounters of the Third Kind as well being another one. I think these types of movies that were quite big during the 70s, I'm sure that was possibly a big appeal at the time. Now, of course, I don't think that's the case anymore. I think that what this has become is a hugely iconic piece of horror cinema and pure horror. I'm not sure that it necessarily is still appealing to people that just want to go see a sci-fi movie that aren't necessarily into horror.
Yeah.
And I think that the appeal now also could be for fans of body horror, like we keep touching upon, fans of Cronenberg's The Fly or Carpenter's The Thing.
Yes.
I don't think that would have been, at the time, I don't think that was even really established as a kind of term or a subgenre, this idea of body horror, because I think Alien helped kind of launch that, really. So I think that in that way, that's definitely changed now. I think that perhaps people in the horror community might be drawn to Alien, not just because it's of its hugely iconic status, but also because it's so famous as this terrifying piece of abject body horror.
Sure.
And it's maybe less riding on the success of movies like Star Wars and Close Encounters, which I think now in 2019,
right,
we know that it couldn't be more different, really, to be honest. Yeah. So I think that's quite interesting.
Andrea, what are your thoughts on this?
I think its appeal is very general, which I think is why it was so successful for its time, that in addition to being very critically successful and holding up within the film community, it was also very commercially successful. And obviously the franchise has gone on and on, even beyond movies. There's comic books, there's fiction, there's everything. And I think that if I could speculate, that points to a very kind of wide appeal.
Yeah.
And nowadays, I think it's looked back upon as it's not only a horror classic, but it's a film classic. Like, I think it came up in my research that it's in the National Registry. It's being archived by the United States as, like a very culturally relevant film. So it's always going to kind of have that standing. But I think horror fans rediscover it all the time. It has that timelessness that makes it universally appealing. And once again, the film just holds up in that regard.
Absolutely. Great thoughts on your part here. So for my take, I would say in 1979, this would have likely appealed to serious horror fans, especially those who went to see Halloween the year before, as well as science fiction lovers, particularly adults who enjoyed Star Wars, right? I think we can agree. But today, I would guess this film has a larger, more mainstream appeal to a wider swath of adult viewers, many of whom are more tolerant nowadays of this type of horror, including body horror. So, yes, of course, there's a strong nostalgia factor for Alien among those exposed to it in its original run. But I think teens and young millennials, they may have a harder time warming up to it because they may consider it too slowly paced with not enough of the monster shown. And to me, that's an unfortunate kind of legacy, not to the movie's discredit, but just, I think, kind of speaking to how new generations it may be a little bit of a tougher climb for them to get to kind of appreciate this movie. But I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the one thing I would say about the movie is that it's still, to me, it hasn't aged a day, and it still has the power to terrify new young generations. I hope, at least.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that.
Yeah, I totally agree. So what elements from Alien have aged well, and what elements maybe are showing some wrinkles? Does anything stand out? Andrea, how about you first, and then Mike?
The only wrinkle I think I could identify, I think overall the film ages remarkably well, even socially, even the way they speak. I don't know if that was intentional on the part of the script, but the slang doesn't feel outdated in the least.
Right.
The old head through the table gag when Ash is deconstructed in pieces, you can see what that is. You can kind of see the seams in that. You can tell when it's the actor and when it's a prosthetic head. But
yeah, there's even a bit of a jump cut there. I went and watched it again. So, there are a few little flaws here and there if you want to look for them.
I've seen worse coming out every day in this day and age. So for 1979, that killed it.
Yeah, think about this, though. At least they didn't have any awfully bad CGI. Thank God.
Yeah, that's to come later in the franchise, isn't it?
Right. All right, Mike, anything that you think has aged well or poorly?
I think 99% of this movie has aged so well. I really struggle to think of things that haven't, actually. I think that, like we talked about, I think the characters are perfect. They're so real and they're so relatable even now. I think that the setting, because it's a very lived-in space, it doesn't look outdated. I don't think this movie shows its limitations in its budget because it's kind of dark and dingy, and it's very controlled with what it shows you and what it doesn't show you. And equally, we can say the same for the xenomorph. I think, like you said, we probably see the alien for about 1 minute of screen time across the whole film. And most of the time, it's done incredibly well. Now, I will say, if I had to pick something that hasn't aged quite as well, it would maybe be those odd few seconds here and there where we catch glimpses of the alien and it does maybe look a bit rubbery or a bit plastic.
Okay.
Now, it's very, very, very brief because we only see the alien so fleetingly anyway. There's one moment, I think it's maybe the scene when Brett, the character played by Harry Dean Stanton, is about to be killed, which is a fantastic, suspenseful, terrifying scene. But as the alien kind of lowers itself down and comes towards him, there's a little... I guess you could say that looks a little bit dated now. Equally, yeah. The chestburster scene is incredible. It hasn't aged a day. But the moment after it, when we see the little chestburster kind of scamper off, again, right. I suppose it looks a little bit like a Muppet. It looks a little bit like Kermit the Frog scampering off. If I was going to be really mean and pick on something, I guess it would be that there are elements of the practical effects that have dated ever so slightly, but also there are elements of the practical effects that hold up incredibly well. So I'm only saying that because that was a very cruel question you asked me there, Eric. I had to pick something that had dated. But other than that, I think this film has aged phenomenally well, actually.
Yeah, I would have to agree pretty wholeheartedly, with maybe a few exceptions I'll get into here. But yeah, for those listening, if it's not already apparent, Mike, Andrea, and I are huge fans of the movie, so we're not looking to open a can of whoop ass on Alien by any stretch. But I actually don't have a problem with any of the few seconds we see the alien. All the things you brought up are pretty spot on, but even the rubbery kind of context of perhaps the practical effects in some shots doesn't bother me. I'm willing to kind of let it go in terms of the Muppetish effect of the chest burster and things like that. So it doesn't really bother me, but some things do. I think the one thing that stands out poorly, and again, it's 1979. It's not a low-budget movie, but they're limited by the technology of the day. When the ship blows up at the end and you have a series, actually 3 different explosions, it looks a bit cheesy.
Yeah.
The whole kind of interior of Mother's main console room with all of those unmarked lights, it just, again, I've seen this in other science fiction movies where it's like they're trying to look impressive with a lot of little twinkly lights, but it doesn't really seem very plausible to me. So things like that sometimes stop me in my tracks, but it doesn't detriment to the entire movie by any stretch. But there are 2 sudden cat appearance jump scares playing into that tiresome cliche. But to me, those jump scares are effective, so I'm willing to let that one go too. But how many times have we seen a cat jump out of the shadows in a horror movie? So maybe that's Ridley Scott and crew kind of just winking at the audience. I would say the xenomorph creature design remains awe-inspiring and terrifying all these years later. The fact that the filmmakers show the monster so little only makes it more frightening. The blue-collar crew in space premise, I think, holds up very well, giving Alien a more believable look and feel and lived-in world populated by real people. Honestly, there aren't a lot of major things that scream antiquated or unacceptable today. I'm trying to think, in terms of the PC crowd or the Me Too movement or something, and I don't feel beholden to answer on their behalf. So, to be honest with you, I really didn't find any problems in terms of the sexual politics per se. Andrea, I'm curious to get your opinion. What would you say about that scene toward the end where we see Ripley undressing herself? And again, we got to think about the context of the times, right? So this is coming off of some major slasher like Halloween and some earlier precedents as well. where the template is, you got to show some TNA in these horror movies at some point. Do you think the filmmakers were going for that, or is this just in keeping with, hey, this shows the vulnerability of Ripley, and hence she has to be in a state of undress so that we and she can feel the terror of the alien in the same vicinity there?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. I think if we're going to take it as true that Ripley was not written to be a woman and that there was just an undressing scene, and now that it's a woman, maybe the camera lingers a little long at her body, but at the same time I feel like, God, her undergarments, here we go, we're going to talk about the fucking panties again, aren't we? We talked about the panties in the Faculty of Horror episode. I was like, God, are we still talking about panties? But we have to talk about it because it is a scene that for me personally, watching it was a bit startling. It made me see her sexually for the first time in the entire film. And I kind of resent that. And I think I especially resent it because I'm not totally convinced that it was intended to be that way. Because, as a woman and a wearer of panties, I know what panties look like, and I know what panties men like to look at. And so while I don't think there was something especially titillating inherent in that scene, it still had that impact for me. But maybe that's saying more about me than it is that film, What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a fair question. It doesn't really bother me, but I don't recall. It's been a while since I've seen some of the making of and bonus features for this film. And I know they do an exhaustive kind of look at that on the Fox DVD and Blu-ray. But my hunch is that, there's a bit of, we're going to have some titillation in here. So how can we kind of shoehorn it in? But it's there if you want to look for it. But on the other hand, I find it plausible that she's getting herself more comfortable, and we need to see that she's in a more vulnerable state. So the fact that we have implications of how the alien performs, pseudo rape on characters in the film, whether with the jaws or the tail or what have you, and that phallic head and so forth, I guess it makes sense subtextually to have her in a physical, more vulnerable state too. So again, I don't have a problem with it, but I'm curious. I wanted to ask you because, again, I know you have some strong feminist views on different films.
Yeah, no problem. I think at the end of the day, and we say this in the Faculty of Horror a lot, is that we'd like to consider what the filmmaker intended and what the camera is telling us to look at and think about. But at the end of the day, what matters is what you took away from it, All
right. I mean, there's much more egregious examples of crassness and exploitation going on in other slashers before and after Alien, so I don't want to pick too much on it. But I just thought that would be an interesting question to ask you.
Sure.
Mike, any final thoughts here on dated versus undated?
I agree. I think there is something. I mean, obviously, yes. I guess in some ways, maybe the movie's having its cake and eating it in that regard because it probably does satisfy a certain 1970s audience. But also, I think you're absolutely right. I think there is a reason for that shot. I think that it really does expose Ripley's vulnerability, and it's maybe the first time that we look upon her as this very vulnerable thing, a movie that one of my favorite movies of all time, favorite horror movie that I've talked about on my podcast is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974.
Right.
And there is a kind of a strange gaze upon our main characters that I wouldn't say is sexual, but there are shots of their bodies at times where it almost just looks like these characters are just slabs of meat. Like we will focus on one of the female characters' bare backs because she's wearing a top that doesn't have a back strap, or some skimpy shorts that a character's wearing. And yes, you could argue that's sort of titillating, but at the same time, there's something about the way it's filmed that to me feels very unsexual, and it's more that we're looking at these human beings quite objectively as these very flimsy, vulnerable slabs of meat for lambs for the slaughter in some way. Whereas if you go back a year to 1978 to John Carpenter's Halloween, which we've mentioned, I think there are clearly scenes in that are titillating. There's the famous scene in which the girl whose boyfriend has gone down to the kitchen to get a beer and then he gets killed. Michael Myers comes up with the sheet over his head. She thinks it's him, and she just exposes her breasts apropos of nothing. That is purely a kind of teen movie titillation, trope. And yeah, I think you're right. I think Ridley Scott with these shots of Sigourney Weaver at this moment in the film is doing something quite different.
You were talking before about the creature design.
I don't think there is a single scarier horror movie monster out there than the Xenomorph. Between the sort of face-hugging part to the chest burster to the actual Xenomorph itself, it's an incredible design.
Absolutely.
Isn't it? And I think it's something to do with how real it is in some ways. Even though it's this alien, it's this otherworldly thing, but there are elements of it that remind us of and of certain animals,
And insects too.
Insects, yeah, exactly. Spiders, and there's enough about it that we can relate to. There's enough about it that is just real enough, but then also otherworldly enough. It's that uncanny element to it that
Exactly.
it hits this kind of sweet spot where it is absolutely terrifying. It will never not be terrifying. I mean, for me, it will always be the face huggers that scare me the most. It's the things that jump at your face and impregnate you through the mouth. Oh my God. I mean, and so often with monster movies, the monster itself can let it down, can let the movie down.
Sure.
But it really doesn't with Alien. My God, what a scary thing.
This is a birthday celebration after all, and birthdays are all about presents, except my theory is always that it's the fans who continue to get the gifts. What is Alien's greatest gift to viewers? Andrea, how about you first and Mike second?
It's not going to sound like much, but it's so good. It's so good, and it's still so good. And this is a film that I think, insofar as we're talking about it years and years and years later, I think it is a classic, and it is at a time where horror movies were very bleak. They were very American, I'm thinking Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Right.
I'm thinking 70s horror has this grit to it, and here's this weird little sci-fi odyssey right at the end of the 70s and into the 80s. So for people who are discovering horror a little later in life and want to come at this film with a more of an adult sensibility, it's going to satisfy.
All right, Mike, what say you?
I guess in most plain and simple terms, it will absolutely scare the living crap out of people, and that is its gift to us. We can discuss this movie forever in terms of its themes, its subtext, everything else. But really, purely and simply, this is a terrifying haunted house ghost train experience, and there's almost no other movie like it in terms of the suspense and the tension and the build up and then the payoff. It's very rare when movies can achieve both so perfectly. I think some movies are great at building up suspense and then maybe it doesn't pay off quite the way you want it to, and other films might be filled with jump scares and blood and guts and gore, but they don't have any suspense, to keep them going. I think this movie has both. I think this movie takes its time. It builds that tension, it lets us kind of bask in this setting and with these characters, and then it wallops us with scenes like the chestburster scene and scenes like the air duct scene. And I think its biggest gift is that it will make you sit there in a cinema or in your living room or wherever in a cold sweat, your heart racing, and you will be truly, truly terrified in a very primal human way. And that is something, as a horror fan, I absolutely love. To some people, that probably doesn't sound like a gift at all. To me, that is the ultimate gift a movie can give me, one that really, to my core, terrifies me.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. My answer to this question is multifold. I think that not only did it introduce Sigourney Weaver as a powerful and popular actress, but Alien demonstrated that women can make effective action heroes. So think about this, right? Ripley sets the template for smart, strong, and empowered female leads in action and genre films to follow. She may not technically have been the first, but I can't think of a lot of precedents before Ripley.
No, you're so right. Absolutely, definitely. I mean, what an incredible character Ripley is, and the sequels is definitely a kind of diminishing returns thing. That the sequels are not great, but Sigourney Weaver is the reason to keep going back to the sequels as well, because she's so great. The character of Ripley is so great. She's an incredible character played by an incredible actress.
She's not given top billing, and she isn't like the lead per se as she is in the sequel, fittingly enough. And of course, there are some precedents in terms of the slasher genre. When you think of the final girl in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and, of course, Halloween, those are some empowered female characters to an extent. They fight back. They're able to escape, for example. But this is a bit different. You're not quite sure that if you've never seen Alien before, you may guess that she may be the final survivor, but most likely not. So she kind of earns that distinction to me of being a strong, empowered character, male or female, but she happens to be female. And I think this helps set the template for, as I said, strong and smart and empowered women in genre films and action films to follow. I also think that the genius of Alien is that science fiction is simply the backdrop. It's, as you said, it's really a haunted house slasher film monster movie at its core, which is to say that its horror components are front and center where they should be. We don't see laser gun fights. We're not shown spaceship battles. There's no C-3PO looking robots.
Yeah.
We don't get a supernatural force that interferes with things. There's none of those trappings that come with typical sci-fi flicks like Star Wars, for example.
Yeah, agreed.
So this, to me, is a horror movie at its core and should be considered as such.
Just building on that, I think, I'd say it's a horror movie first, a science fiction movie second. That's the thing, and maybe the sequel's the other way around. That's the difference, isn't it? But this movie, absolutely, like you said, it's sci-fi as the backdrop. This is first and foremost a terrifying haunted house movie.
And as you so eloquently put it earlier, I mean, H.R. Geiger's Xenomorph is quite possibly the most nightmarish and fear-inducing creature ever created for the cinema, let alone an extraterrestrial alien. How about just monster?
Yeah, agreed.
When you think about the appearance and the characteristics of this creature, the inner jaws dripping with some kind of saliva, acid for blood, eyeless phallic head, whipsaw tail. It's the most unique and effective creature design I've probably ever seen. And then you add to that the egg and face hugger. They're masterworks of creative visual ingenuity, too.
Yeah.
Is there a better alien ever made for the movies, or creature for that matter, than Alien?
There is not. There is absolutely not. It is, I kind of agree with Ash here. It is a perfect thing. It is a perfect organism. I don't know how they did it, whether, like you said, it was Dan O'Bannon or Giga or Scott, but the way this thing works, and the way in which it gives you enough details where you can understand its biology, you can understand how it reproduces, you understand its blood is acidic. There's all these little details about it that make it really feel like this real thing that you can believe exists. But also it is like something from your nightmares too, and it's this just perfect combination of things that make it the ultimate horror movie monster. Like you said, there's nothing scarier in cinema than this monster.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And I think, it's not, some 80s horror is really appealing to a younger audience. Like I grew up, I was young in the early 80s. And so like the sleepover films were stuff like Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th. The slasher genre is kind of,
right.
It's so bombastic and funny and like, it's fun for little kids. It does take a little bit of maturity to really appreciate all that Alien has to offer.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think if anyone's listening to this and you haven't seen it since you were a kid, you absolutely do need to rewatch because some things might have skated by you. Yeah,
it's a totally different watch as an adult than, let's say, a kid or a teenager, in my opinion. And that's part of the answer to that is the pacing. When you see this as a younger person, this is what I've heard from a lot of people is, oh, gosh, it's slow. Like, when is it going to get somewhere? And you don't see the monster until halfway through the movie, et cetera, et cetera. But those are all the hallmarks of a really great movie. It's the reason why Jaws is so effective. It's the reason why so many great horror or monster or creature movies are effective and well-remembered. It's because you withhold showing the monster. You build the tension slowly and organically as opposed to just, nonstop jump scares and get right into it. And I think you know what I'm talking about. Here, it feels like old school type of horror filmmaking, but with modern sensibilities that even 40 years later, I think we can all appreciate if you look closely enough.
I sure can.
Yeah.
To me, the only close proximity is the shark in Jaws, which is a real biological creature on our planet that exists. Yeah. And it also, at least in 75, when that movie's released, it also is a more mysterious creature because we didn't know as much about sharks, and we still don't know that much about sharks. But this is something completely different. This is extraterrestrial. This is fear of the unknown because the vast majority of human beings have never been to space or encountered an alien creature. Yes, there are more iconic monsters in cinema history, like Frankenstein, for example, or Dracula, or things like that. But I'm talking about the combination of creativity, visual ingenuity, absolutely terrifying physical characteristics, completely unique design. There is not a better creature slash monster slash alien in movie history than the xenomorph. Do you think Alien will still be widely watched and considered relevant in another 40 years? What do you think here?
I think it will. I think, like we've discussed already, there's so little about this movie that dates it or feels like a movie made in 1979, and for that reason, it is going to stand the test of time. I think we will always be scared of the dark. We'll always be scared of space, probably. We'll always be scared of otherworldly things. We'll always be scared of our own bodies and things, parasites getting inside our bodies. We're always going to be scared of these other primal fears of rape, of infection, of everything else. I think, the things that make this movie great are never, ever going to age. So, I think it will always be enjoyed by audiences of generations to come. Now, whether or not people will still also enjoy Aliens, I've got a lot of friends who... And an argument that I have a lot with friends and other people, other sort of film lovers, is which is the better movie, Alien or Aliens? Now, I will always say Alien because I'm a horror purist, but a lot of people feel the same way about the sequel directed by James Cameron as well, that is a sci-fi horror masterpiece that will also go down in history. So they're a great pairing in some ways, but for me, Alien is timeless, absolutely timeless in a literal, in the most sort of classic way. So it will absolutely still be enjoyed by audiences in 40 years' time.
And Andrea, project 40 years into the future. Is Alien still going to be treasured?
Absolutely. I think it's always going to be a snapshot of its time. It's always going to be an example of the team behind it. It's going to be an example of some of their greatest work, some of the best work done in horror. It's foundational in horror and indeed in cinema. Maybe in the future we will have some space travel going on. So maybe in the future we can look back and that technology will be off the mark, or maybe it'll be right on the mark. So that'll be interesting. But in terms of how human beings relate to one another, how they're well-meaning but can still fuck each other over, I think that's something that's still going to resonate years and years from now.
Yes, great thoughts from both of you. Mike, what you said a moment ago about all the different elements imbued into Alien that make it the masterpiece it is, it's all of those ingredients, right? It's all of those timeless evergreen themes that the filmmakers built into it. Our endless fear and fascination with body horror, with fear of penetration and rape, and all of those things brought up earlier. I agree. These are the components that will keep Alien fresh and continue to be watched going forward. Even though, as I said, younger generations, it may be a slower burn that they have to get used to, and they may find some more kind of tiresome or slow elements to it. I think the payoff will continue to be effective for continued generations. So, I have faith that Alien will be a go-to nostalgic watch for horror fans of many generations as they age, and will continue to be regarded as one of the greatest horror films and arguably the very best horror sci-fi hybrid of all time. You consider that, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going for this movie, and I don't think we have to worry too much about its legacy because, again, it's part of a franchise. It's such a famous creature and character in Ripley. They're going to continue to make sequels and prequels and all of that stuff for better or worse, so I think it's going to remain in the public consciousness for quite some time to come. So, Andrea, what are you currently working on that listeners should check out? Any upcoming things with either Faculty of Horror podcast or Rue Morgue that you can tell us about?
Well, both those things are ongoing, and I'm happy to say picking up steam. For Faculty of Horror, we've been going it's going to be 7 years in December.
Wow.
I can't even believe I'm saying that. We just launched a Patreon, and we just launched it last month, and it's been going really well. I think we were finally in a place with the podcast where Alex and I were able to offer additional content to people who wanted to support us financially. And
fantastic.
The support has been overwhelming, and as a result, we've been able to outsource some of the labor and come up with even more stuff. So this is so it's been really exciting to watch the Faculty of Horror grow over the last 7 years. So there's never been a better time to jump into the Faculty of Horror. If you're not familiar with the show, it comes out once a month, and we deep dive on, sometimes it's topics, sometimes it's films, sometimes it's a couple of films that share a particular topic, but It's all in the course notes. And yeah, so that's the podcast.
Oh, terrific. We'll look forward to that. And how about Rue Morgue? Anything coming up that you want to tell the listeners about?
Rue Morgue's mandate has always been to be very expansive and inclusive. We're not just talking about movies, we're talking about music, we're talking about books, we're talking about comic books, so we're talking about culture and all of that stuff. So I just put the November-December issue to bed, and I'm working on January, February now. So I'm already in the year 2020, but the
Right.
November-December issue is being printed as we speak. And
Cool.
and here's a little tidbit for your listeners. The cover story is on The Lodge, which is Severin Fiala and Veronica Franz's new movie. But it's a wonderful film, and The Lodge is their first English language production, and that's going to be out in November, and that's on the cover, and I really loved it, so I'm really excited for everyone to check that out.
So we'll keep our eye out for that issue and those other issues you mentioned coming out. And Mike, what are you currently working on that listeners should check out, including, of course, your Evolution of Horror podcast?
Well, there's quite a lot. I've got so my podcast is called The Evolution of Horror, which for horror fans, hopefully there's something here you'd be interested in. We kind of look at the history of the genre, and we talk about it a little bit like me and you have been talking about it today, Eric. So we look back at some of the most iconic movies in the genre's history and look at their influence and their legacy, and we do it by looking at specific subgenres or areas of horror. So we spent an entire first series looking at the evolution of the slasher movie, and we delved into everything week by week, from Psycho and Peeping Tom all the way through to sort of modern day slashers via kind of Halloween and Friday the 13th and that kind of thing. And then we did a whole series on ghost stories. We did a whole series on the zombie movie and the way that's evolved. So we're just about to kick off with a brand new series, which is going to look at the evolution of the occult in horror, which it's a very broad term.
Fantastic.
But generally speaking, we're going to be dealing with all movies that deal with kind of Satanism and witchcraft and the dark arts and that kind of thing. So we're going to be doing some absolute classics of the genre. We'll be covering The Exorcist, The Omen, Rosemary's Baby, some really classic kind of witch movies as well. Some really incredible movies to cover in this series.
Awesome. Cannot wait.
Yeah, absolutely can't wait for that. So that's going to be kicking off around Halloween. That's when the new series will start. But you can still listen to all of the other episodes. If you want to find us, you can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. We've got a website with all of the episodes on there as well, evolutionofhorror.com. Or you can just follow us on Twitter @EvolutionPod.
Fantastic, or should I say brilliant? I love when you say brilliant because, again, I'm not from the UK, and I know that's a kind of a oft-used expression in your neck of the woods, but I just love hearing it. So, Andrea, I just want to thank you again for just taking the time and taking a deeper dive with us into Alien, and happy Halloween season.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much for having me, and happy Halloween, everyone.
And Mike, it was a great pleasure having you as a guest as well.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Eric. I really appreciate being asked, so thank you very much.
Wow, I am one lucky guy getting two of the biggest horror podcasters out there to say yes to my show. Thanks again to Andrea Subissati and Mike Muncer for appearing on Cineversary. Time now for Standing Ovations. This is where I give a shout out to a movie, book, website, TV program, podcast, or other work that I think would be of interest to classic film lovers. My standing ovation for October is The Beast Within, Making Alien, which is a collective 3-hour bonus feature you can find on the Alien Quadrilogy box set. Andrea mentioned a new documentary on the making of Alien that's out right now called Memory, The Origins of Alien, and from what I understand, it's gotten a lot of critical acclaim. But I'm also hearing that this new shorter doc is a retread of what's covered in The Beast Within, which is nearly twice as long. Now, The Beast Within is one of the very best behind-the-scenes doc I have ever watched. It takes an exhaustively detailed foray deep into the heart of the first Alien film. And right now, Amazon's got the Alien Quadrilogy Blu-ray set comprising the first 4 Alien films for less than $20. I own it and can personally testify that it's worth every penny, and no, I am not a paid shill for Jeff Bezos' company. Do yourself a favor and buy, borrow, or check out from the library the Quadrilogy box set and watch this masterpiece of a making of. But wait, there's another standing ovations for October. It's actually a personal plug. I made a guest appearance on the Classic Film Jerks podcast for its September episode, in which hosts Michael DiGiovanni and Andrew Bloom took a deep-sea dive with me into Jaws, Steven Spielberg's 1975 landmark horror film. I got a chance to dish some facts and opinions with the fellas and have a few laughs along the way. Now, you can catch the Classic Film Jerks podcast wherever you find your podcasts, and remember, this was the September episode. All right, I know this was an extra long edition of Cineversary, but I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, want to do me a solid? I really want to grow our audience, and I need your help. Can you please spread the good word about this show to those you know? As a bonus favor, I'd be ever so grateful if you could leave me positive reviews on whatever platform you hear it from, which helps this show get discovered by new listeners. Want to suggest a future movie due to celebrate an anniversary that we should consider devoting an episode to? Do you have a burning question for me? Or maybe you just want to offer some suggestions or comments? Well, you can get a hold of me, Eric Martin, at cineversegroup@gmail.com. You can also visit my website, cineversegroup.com, which is the portal for my Cineverse film discussion group that I launched 14 years ago and which continues to meet weekly in the South Suburban Chicago area. Cineverse is a democratic film society that watches and then discusses a predetermined movie that our members pick on a rotating basis. At that website, and it's spelled cineversegroup.com, you can hear podcast recordings of our group discussions and read more about the films we study. I founded Cineverse and launched this podcast to foster an appreciation for and intelligent dialogue about memorable films. All right, you're probably wondering what's up next. Well, November is right around the corner, and that's when Cineversary will feat one of the all-time greatest film noir movies, Double Indemnity, originally released in 1944 and celebrating a 75th anniversary this year. Be sure to join us for that installment. This has been your humble host, Eric Martin, reminding you to butter up that popcorn, live a big screen surround sound life, and cherish those classic movies because, hey, little secret, they're not getting older, folks. They're just getting better. Thanks again for giving us a listen.